All right, we're back. YouTube is allowing us to record again, and we're live. Last time, I don't think it went out, but we read W.K. Clifford's really interesting essay on questioning whether or not it's ever ethical to believe something without enough evidence. And in the after show, we talked about that, and we talked about the Jamesian response to that type of an idea. I mean, it's a pretty extreme idea that he has there, but it was very wisely argued. So that was interesting. Um, so let's look at Anthony Flew. All right. Remember, we're about to dive into the intro course for philosophy of religion. But before we do that, we have these two sections. And the first section is it ever, it's the question of, is faith a good thing ever? And in what ways is it? Is it necessary and indispensable? Is it the greatest of things? So we're going to be debating the nature of faith and believing to start out with. And then the next preliminary section that we have to do, which we get to do, is a meta philosophical, it's a meta theological question of how do we as philosophers adjudicate the meaningfulness of God talk at all. If this is something so infinite, how can we accurately talk about it at all? And so we're going to look at essays from a lot of different perspectives on each of these two questions before we dive into uh, the rest of arguments for God's existence and against it, and problem of evil and the attributes of God and ethical. That we're going to dive into all the rest of that after we do these two. So here's our third essay, Anthony Flew. The presumption of atheism, what it is and why it matters. The presumption of atheism, which I want to discuss, is not a form of presumptuousness. Oh, look at this. The feds are always making my phone. I am a very unpopular person, but my phone has to start doing this every time we start. Okay, it's off now. I'm joking about the feds. All right. The presumption of atheism, which I want to discuss, is not a form of presumptuousness. Indeed, it might be regarded as an expression of the very opposite, a modest teachability. What I want to examine of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, that the onus of proof must lie upon the theist. We're going to read a couple of essays here arguing who has the burden of proof. And so here we go. This guy's going to argue, Anthony Flew. I shouldn't just say this guy, he'll show up again. He's going to argue the believer has the onus, he has the burden of proof. We should presume atheism is correct unless we get a good argument. Okay. The word atheism, however, has in this contention to be construed unusually. Whereas nowadays, the usual meaning of atheist in English is, quote, someone who asserts that there is no such being as God. I want the word to be understood not positively, but negatively. I want the original Greek prefix "a" to be read in the same way in atheism as it is customarily read in such other Greco English words as amoral, atypical, and asymmetrical. In this interpretation, an atheist becomes not someone who positively asserts the non existence of God, but someone who is simply not a theist. Let us, for future ready reference, introduce the labels positive atheist for the former and negative atheist for the latter. This terminology has been widely adopted, not thoroughly, but it's been widely adopted by later. You've heard these terms before. Anthony Flew is giving you the source. I think I said early on in the year one material that one of the fun things about reading philosophy is that you realize everybody's using terms and now you get to meet the people who invented them or made them popular. So okay, so we've got some categories. Positive atheist says, I am asserting that there is no God. I'm going to give arguments that that's the case. The way Anthony Flew wants us to think about atheism is what he's going to call negative atheism, which is saying, I don't believe in a God because I haven't been shown a good reason to believe in a God yet. And so I could be brought. I don't have an argument that says he definitely doesn't exist or it's even likely that he doesn't exist. I'm just saying, hey, the burden's on you to give me a reason to think this. Okay. And I've looked at your arguments and found them lacking, something like that. What the protagonist of My Presumption of Atheism wants to show is that the debate about the existence of God ought to be conducted in a particular way, and that the issue should be seen in a certain perspective. His thesis about the onus of proof involves that it is up to the theist first to introduce and to defend his proposed concept of God, and second, to provide sufficient reason for believing that this concept of his does, in fact, have an application. It is the first of these two stages which needs perhaps to be emphasized even more strongly than the second. Whereas the question of existence concerns, for instance, a Loch Ness monster or an abominable snowman, this stage may perhaps reasonably be deemed to be more or less complete before the argument begins. But in the controversy about the existence of God, this is certainly not so, not only for the quite familiar reason that the word God is used or misused in many different ways, but also, and much more interestingly, because it cannot be taken for granted that even the would be mainstream theist is operating with a legitimate concept which theoretically could have an application to an actual being. Okay. So he's got a lot of questions. He's got a lot of points of skepticism and a lot of points of saying, now, hold on a second. I'm here being a reasonable, rational person. If you want me to agree with you on your theistic positions, first you have to show me one, that you have a notion of God that isn't absurd, that could actually be real to begin with, that means something that I can understand what it means. And then you have to give me an argument that this notion of yours actually does, in fact, exist. And if you don't do either of those, I should, he's arguing, properly call myself a negative atheist or an atheist in the negative sense, where I'm not saying I know there is no God, but I am saying I don't believe in God. I've yet to be shown that there is one, and so I don't affirm things for which I don't have reason. That's basically his position. Okay, so far. This last suggestion is not really as newfangled and factitious as it is sometimes thought to be, but its pedigree has been made a little hard to trace. For the fact is that traditionally, issues which should be seen as concerning the legitimacy or otherwise of a proposed or supposed concept have by philosophical theologians been discussed either as surely disposable difficulties in reconciling one particular feature of the divine nature with another, or else as aspects of an equally surely soluble general problem of saying something about the infinite creator in language intelligible to his infinite creatures. These traditional and still almost universally accepted forms of presentation are fundamentally prejudicial, for they assume that there is a divine being with an actual nature, the features of which we can investigate. They assume that there is an infinite creator whose existence, whatever difficulties we finite creatures may have in asserting anything else about him, we may take for granted. The general reason why this presumption of atheism matters is I just want to read the next paragraph to see in context that last one. Okay. So the reason why this general presumption of atheism matters is that its acceptance must put the whole question of the existence of God into an entirely fresh perspective. Most immediately relevant here is that in this fresh perspective, problems which really are conceptual are seen as conceptual problems, and problems which have tended to be regarded as advanced and, so to speak, optional extras now discover themselves as both elementary and indispensable. The theist who wants to build a systematic and thorough apologetic finds that he is required to begin absolutely from the beginning. This absolute beginning is to ensure that the word God is provided with a meaning such that it is theoretically possible for an actual being to be so described. Okay. I'm not sure if I agree with his interpretation of the state of the argument, but it's a good argument he's making and here's what he's saying. What he's saying is, look, I mean, it's a good argument if it was applicable. All right, so what he's saying is, look, there's all these arguments about can God be all loving and all just at the same time? How can evil exist and God exist at the same time? And he's saying, okay, the answers to those tend to be in either one of two categories. Either we're talking about something so beyond us and infinite that it makes sense that we can't really wrap our heads around it, but it's the God is telling us it's true, and we can think it's true and try to, even though we can't fully understand it. Or what was his other category? His other category was, oh, by just showing that, like, a supposed incompatibility is not right, to explain it away, by showing that a supposed incompatibility between an all good and all powerful God and the existence of evil, or an all just God and an all loving God, or an all merciful God and an all just God. Like how, there's theologians trying to reconcile those ideas. And what he says is, okay, what this whole conversation needs, and the libraries of books full of theologians trying to sort these things out, which we're going to get into some of them. It's going to be really fun. He says, look, what you really need is a guy like me to show up in the room who says, okay, before any of those conversations even need to really be addressed, I first need you to give me a definition of the idea of God that's comprehensible. In other words, something that isn't inherently self contradictory and that is of a thing that could possibly exist. And then once you've done that, I need you to argue successfully and show me reasons why he does, in fact, exist, or it does, or she does, or whatever. And then once you've done those two things, then we can start trying to figure out the attributes of God and that other stuff. But he says the proper place for us to start would be the presumption, right? We're presuming atheism, but we're open, right? We're not positive atheists who say, no, I've got an argument. It can't be true, or it's certainly not true, or something. We're just saying, no, I'm open, but you've got to prove those two things first. That's how he wants to frame the debate, essentially. Okay. Although I shall later be arguing that the presumption of atheism is neutral as between all parties to the main dispute, inasmuch as to accept it as determining a procedural framework is not to make any substantive assumptions. I must give fair warning now that I do nevertheless believe that in its fresh perspective, the whole enterprise of theism appears even more difficult and precarious than it did before. In part, this is a corollary of what I have just been suggesting, that certain difficulties and objections, which may previously have seemed peripheral or even factitious, are made to stand out as fundamental and unavoidable. But it is also in part, as we shall be seeing soon, a consequence of the emphasis which it places on the interpretive need to produce some sort of sufficient reason to justify theistic belief. Okay, so he thinks this reframe is going to do a pretty powerful thing. What's going to do is say, okay, you can debate how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And you might think that you're debating something like that, very peripheral, out there. Ooh, we're going to try to figure out some strange thing about God's justice and his love and his mercy all being absolute and at one and not in contradiction to each other. You might think that's just an interesting question for theologians who are already theists. But now that I've reframed it, if you presume atheism and you realize that two burdens are on the theist, first to show me a notion of God that has meaning, and then secondly to show me that he exists, that first one, the notion of God that has meaning, that's not a peripheral question anymore. Those peripheral questions are suddenly right dead center. Okay. If what you say is God is all good and all loving and all powerful and all of this stuff, and I look at you and I say, I think all powerful is a meaningless term, or I think there's a contradiction between all knowing and all powerful, or between all powerful and all good, or something like that, then you haven't even completed the first necessary step of showing me a notion of God that isn't incoherent or self-contradictory. So now it's not just, oh, hey, that's a fun thing to handle. Like you can imagine a group of theologians, and I don't think this is an accurate description of what they even thought they were doing, but you could imagine hypothetically a group of theologians who saw themselves as scientists who were just sort of settling a bunch of little questions on the topic of God or something. He goes, no, no, no. The nature of God and the difficulties with it philosophically are right front and center now, because you have to rectify all of those things before I even have a coherent notion of God that you can ask me to believe in. And then you have to do the second thing, which is to demonstrate that that thing exists. This is why he brings up the abominable snowman or the Loch Ness monster. He says, to prove to me that those things are true, the first part of it is not hard at all. We all know what we're talking about. We all know what the Loch Ness monster is. In general, here's a category. It's some sort of lit, uh, a littoral creature that is, prehistoric, dinosaur-like, whatever. It's a lake-dwelling dinosaur-like creature that's, contemporary, present in modern day or whatever. Fine. We all know that. So now you can go on to try to show the evidence that it exists, or we can debate about that, or the evidence that it doesn't exist. But he says with the God notion, this God notion is a very tricky notion. And if you can't convince me that you're even being coherent when you're talking about him, then we can't even get on to investigating whether or not he's real. Okay. So this is his position. Let's look at part two, the presumption of atheism and the presumption of innocence. Okay. One thing which helps to conceal this need is a confusion about the possible varieties of proof. And this confusion is one which can be resolved with the help of the first of a series of comparisons between my proposed presumption of atheism and the legal presumption of innocence. One, it is frequently said nowadays, even by professing Roman Catholics, that everyone knows that it is impossible to prove the existence of God. The first objection to this putative truism is, as my reference to Roman Catholics should have suggested, that it is not true. Oh, he's being cheeky. I like that. For it is an essential dogma of Roman Catholicism, defined as such by the First Vatican Council, that, quote, the one and true God, our Creator and Lord, can be known for certain through the creation by the natural light of human reason, unquote. So, even if this dogma is, as I myself believe, false, it is certainly not known to be false by those many Roman Catholics who remain, despite all the disturbances consequent upon the Second Vatican Council, committed to the complete traditional faith. To this, a sophisticated objector might reply that the definition of the First Vatican Council speaks of knowing for certain rather than of proving or demonstrating, adding perhaps, if he was very sophisticated indeed, that the word demonstrari, demonstrari in an earlier draft was eventually replaced by the expression certo cognosci. All right. So a demonstration versus certain knowledge. And they went with certain knowledge instead of a demonstration. Okay, but allowing that this is correct, it is certainly not enough to vindicate the conventional wisdom. For the word proof is not ordinarily restricted in its application to demonstratively valid arguments, that is, in which the conclusion cannot be denied without thereby contradicting the premises. So it is too flattering to suggest that most of those who make this facile claim, that everyone knows that it is impossible to prove the existence of God, are intending only the strictly limited assertion that one special sort of proof, demonstrative proof, is impossible. The truth and the danger is that wherever there is any awareness of such a limited and specialized interpretation, there will be a quick and illegitimate move to the much wider general conclusion that it is impossible and furthermore unnecessary to provide any sufficient reason for believing. It is therefore worth underlying that when the presumption of atheism is explained as insisting that the onus of proof must be on the theist, the word proof is being used in the ordinary wide sense in which it can embrace any and every variety of sufficient reason. It is, of course, in this and only this sense that the word is interpreted when the presumption of innocence is explained as laying the onus of proof on the prosecution. Second, two, a second element of positive analogy between the two presumptions is that both are defeasible and that they are consequently not to be identified with assumptions. The presumption of innocence indicates where the court should start and how it must proceed. Yet the prosecution is still able, more often than not, to bring forth what is in the end accepted as sufficient reason to warrant the verdict guilty. which appropriate sufficient reason which appropriate sufficient reason is properly characterized as a proof of guilt. The defeasible presumption of innocence is thus, in this majority of cases, in fact, defeated. Were the indefeasible innocence of all accused persons an assumption of any legal system, then there could not be within that system any provision for any verdict other than not guilty. To the extent that it is, for instance, an assumption of the English common law that every citizen is cognizant of all that the law requires of him, that law cannot admit the fact that this assumption is, as in fact it is, false. Okay, we know what he's saying, so we'll just keep moving. The presumption of it's one comment we could make though is that this is a very open-minded, noble, and good way of approaching the question of God's existence, unless you're on some. Okay, so we'll put that aside for a moment. But what he's saying is, look, I'm not saying we should presume atheism is true and then not have the conversation. I'm saying we should start with the presumption that it's true, just like a court starts with the presumption that an accused man is innocent. And then we should allow the prosecution, we should allow the other side, the theists in this case, to present their arguments. First, they have to show that they have a notion that is understandable and comprehensible and not self contradictory. And then once they've done that, they have to show that it actually exists. And our presumption is defeasible, right? So we're not presuming, of course, no one could ever prove to me that God exists, la, 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 I'm not listening. We're saying, okay, you have something to prove, and we think you might be able to do it, and we're open to hearing the case like that. Okay. So his presumption of atheism, it should not be misconstrued to mean that he thinks you should just be an atheist and never change from that position. And likewise, and also, the presumption is that the existence of God is something that somebody could demonstrate. Okay, and that's important, right? Because otherwise, this presumption of atheism is meaningless, or it's a pretty bizarre thing. So first of all, you can't presume atheism and put the burden of proof on somebody else if you don't actually think that it's possible that they could prove it. And furthermore, you have to be open to that proof if presented. Okay, the presumption of atheism is similarly defeasible. It lays it down that thorough and systematic inquiry must start from a position of negative atheism, and that the burden of proof lies on the theist proposition. Yet this is not at the same Yet this is not all the same thing as demanding that the debate should proceed on either a positive or a negative atheistic assumption, which must preclude a theist conclusion. Counsel for theism no more betrays his client by accepting the framework determined by this presumption than counsel for the prosecution betrays the state of conceding the legal presumption of innocence. The latter is perhaps in his heart unshakably convinced of the guilt of the defendant. Yet he must, and with complete consistency and perfect sincerity, may insist that the proceedings of the court should respect the presumption of innocence. All right. He's encouraging the theist to join him in the ring. He's basically saying, "Hey, I'm in the square circle. I got my boxing gloves on. I'm calling y'all out. Here's what you got to do." It's uh, sorry, it's a funny image. The images of Andy Kaufman calling out the ladies to say, "Hey, no woman can beat a man in wrestling," and then saying, "You've got to pin me. I don't have to pin you." Right? So Andy Kaufman's in the ring and he's saying, "Hey, no women could beat a man at wrestling." And then women are coming up. This was in the 80s, maybe 70s, 80s, sometime around there. And then they come up, "I'll give $1,000 to any woman who can pin me. You have to pin me. I don't have to pin you." Okay, so that's what Anthony Flu's doing. He's saying, "Hey, come on, you should do this. It's a fair fight. I think you might win. I'm in the ring. It's possible you could win, but you need to pin me. You need to prove it. This is what you have to do to win the bat." So he's saying, and you shouldn't say, "Oh, that's a waste of my time because you're a presumptive atheist. You're presuming atheism." He goes, "Yeah, just like a court presumes the innocence of a charged person, of an accused person. I presume it, but I'm ready to hear the argument. I'm ready. I'm open to the idea that you could demonstrate to me this thing that you believe." And You don't have to become slightly atheistic to come talk to me. You can be sure that there's a God. And at the same time, and with all sincerity, you could say, I'm glad you're asking me to prove it. That's all I'm saying. That's my whole presumption of atheism is that it would be appropriate for you to prove it to me. And here's the two things you would have to do that. Okay. Uh, just like the counsel for an accused person is not betraying his client by saying, I think it's important, or no, the prosecution of an accused person is not betraying their case just by saying, I'm glad the court presumes him innocent. Let me show you why he's guilty. The latter is perhaps in his heart unshakably convinced of the guilt of the defendant, yet he must, and with complete consistency and perfect sincerity, may insist that the proceedings of the court should respect the presumption of innocence. The former is even more likely to be persuaded of the soundness of his brief. Yet, he too can, with a good conscience, allow that a thorough and complete apologetic must start from, meet, and go on to defeat the presumption of atheism. Three, third point about he's advocating we all start this argument with a presumption of atheism. Here's the third comment he wants to make about this presumption. However, and here we come to a third element of the in the positive analogy, to say that such presumptions are in themselves procedural and not substantive is not to say that the higher order questions of whether to follow this presumption or that are trifling and merely formal rather than material and substantial. These higher order questions are not questions which can be dismissed cynically as issues of principle as opposed to issues of substance. It can matter a lot which presumption is adopted. Notoriously, there is a world of difference between legal systems which follow the presumption of innocence and those which do not. Okay, so it might seem weird to stress all this, uh, just so we can understand exactly what he's saying. He's just saying, look, just like the presumption of innocence, I think we should presume atheism and ask the other side to make a case. Don't worry, that doesn't mean you have to be an atheist. You can come and make a case. You can be sure there's a God, but you should do it in the context of believing that you need to prove it from scratch and you need to all the burden is on you. That's all I'm saying is accept that the burden is on you to make this case. And furthermore, just because I'm saying, I'm not trying to, and it's a negative atheism, not a positive atheism. So I'm just saying we're presuming, but we're open to being proved otherwise. But then he says, "But just because it sounds like I'm making this point that's almost procedural, it's not. It's very important because everything about the way the arguments work is going to hinge on whether or not we approach them in this way." The fourth connection he wants to make between the presumption of innocence in a court and the presumption of atheism in this debate is as follows. Next, as a fourth element in the positive analogy, it is a paradoxical consequence of the fact that these presumptions are procedural and not substantive, that particular defeats do not constitute any sort of reason, much less a sufficient reason for a general surrender. The fact that George Joseph Smith was in his trial proved guilty of many murders defeats the original presumption of his innocence. But this particular defeat has no tendency at all to show that even in this particular case, the court should not have proceeded on this presumption. Still less does it tend to establish that the legal system as a whole was at fault in incorporating this presumption as a general principle. It is the same with the presumption of atheism. Suppose that someone is able to prove the existence of God. This achievement must, similarly, defeat our presumption, but it does not thereby show that the original contention about the onus of proof was mistaken. And we're not going to repeat this anymore. He's just saying, even if you do prove that God exists, that doesn't mean I was wrong to ask you to prove it. That we should start with this presumption is still correct, even if atheism turns out to be wrong. Okay, part three, the case for the presumption of atheism. What does show the presumption of atheism to be the right one is what we have now to investigate. One, an obvious first move is to appeal to the old legal axiom e incumbit probatio qui dicit non qui negat. Literally and unsympathetically translated, this becomes the onus of proof lies on the man who affirms, not on the man who denies. To this, the objection is almost equally obvious. Given just a very little verbal ingenuity, the contention of any motion can be rendered alternatively in either a negative or a positive form, either quote, that this house affirms the existence of God, or that this house takes its stand for positive atheism. So interpreted, therefore, our axiom provides no determinate guidance. Suppose, however, that we take the hint already offered in the previous paragraph. A less literal but more sympathetic translation might be the onus of proof lies on the proposition, not on the opposition. The point of the change is to bring out that this maxim was offered in a legal context and that our courts are institutions of debate. Our courts are institutions of debate. An axiom providing no determinate guidance outside that framework may nevertheless be fundamental for the effective conduct of orderly and decisive debate. Here, the outcome is supposed to be decided on the merits of what is said within the debate itself and of that alone. So, no opposition can set about demolishing the proposition, the proposition case, until and unless that proposition has first provided them with a case for demolition. You've got to get something on your plate before you can start messing it around. Quote from Sense and Sensibility. Of course, our maxim, even when thus sympathetically interpreted, still offers no direction on which contending parties ought to be made to undertake which roles, granting that courts are to operate as debating institutions, and granting that this maxim is fundamental to debate, we have to appeal to some further premise, principle, before we become licensed to infer that the prosecution must propose and the defense oppose. This further principle is, once again, the familiar presumption of innocence. Were we, while retaining the conception of a court as an institution for reaching decisions by way of formalized debate, to embrace the opposite presumption, the presumption of guilt, oh, I'm sorry, the presumption of guilt, we should need to adopt the opposite arrangements. In these, the defense would first propose that the accused is, after all, innocent, and the prosecution would then respond by struggling to disintegrate the case proposed. Two, the first move, examined, cannot, therefore, be by itself sufficient. To have considered it does nevertheless help to show that to accept such a presumption is to adopt a policy, and policies have to be assessed by reference to the aims of those for whom they are suggested. If for you it is more important that no guilty person shall ever be acquitted than that no innocent person shall ever be convicted, then for you a presumption of guilt would be the rational policy. For you, with your preference structure, a presumption of innocent becomes simply irrational. To adopt this policy would be to adopt means calculated to frustrate your own chosen ends, which is surely pragmatically irrational. What then are the aims by reference to which an atheist presumption might be justified? One keyword in the answer, if not the keyword, must be knowledge. The context for which such a policy is proposed is that of inquiry about the existence of God, and the object of the exercise is presumably to discover whether it is possible to establish that the word God does in fact have application. It applies to something. Now, to establish must here be either to show that you know or to come to know. But knowledge is crucially different from mere true belief. All knowledge involves true belief. Not all true belief constitutes knowledge. To have a true belief is simply and solely to believe that something is so, and to be, in fact, right. But someone may believe that this or that is so, and his belief may, in fact, be true without its thereby and necessarily constituting knowledge. If a true belief is to achieve this more elevated status, then the believer has to be properly warranted so to believe. He must, that is, be in a position to know. It is, therefore, not only incongruous, but also scandalous in matters of life and death, and even of eternal life and death, to maintain that you know either on no grounds at all or on grounds of a kind which, on other and on comparatively minor issues, you yourself would insist to be inadequate. All right, before we read the last paragraph, let's talk about what he's saying here. Really quickly, he's saying, you might believe there is a God. And there might actually be a God. So you're right in your belief. You have a true belief. But what we're debating here is whether or not you know that there's a God, whether or not you can prove that there's a God, right? So if what we're debating here is a subject of knowledge, if I want to know that there's a God and I think I can come to know that there's a God through this debate, I'm going to make the presumption of atheism because knowing that there is a God is knowledge. And remember, I defined atheism as a negative kind of atheism. So my atheism isn't the claim that I know there is no God. It's the claim that I say, I don't yet affirm that there's a God because I have to be convinced by argument first. Okay. So his presumption of atheism is, we could call it weak atheism or negative atheism. People use either of those terms for this or for similar things to this. But we could say, okay, his negative atheism, as he defines it, is a kind of atheism that says it's a presumption that someone needs to demonstrate to me the meaningfulness of the term God and the fact that it applies to someone somewhere, something like that, that it's real. Okay. When they present those arguments, and I examine those arguments and I debate with them over those arguments, and then I'm convinced that they are correct, then I will affirm that God is real and I will know that there is a God. Because the point of this debate is to get knowledge. But because the point is to get knowledge, you should start with atheism. You should presume negative atheism because even if there is a God, and even if you believe that he exists, if you don't have reasons to believe he exists, if you don't have an argument, if you don't have any position that would justify your saying to other people, I know that there's a God, you don't actually know it. You believe it and you're right. Congratulations. But knowledge is what we're after here. I want to know whether or not there's a God. That's a bit of knowledge. God exists. If that's true, I don't just want to believe it, I want to know that it's true. That's why we're debating and having our philosophical discussion. And so he's saying, okay, there's three prongs to knowledge. The thing has to be true, right? If I believe something and I have a good reason to believe it and it's not true, then that's not knowledge. If it has to be true and I have to believe it, right? If it's true and there are arguments to demonstrate that it's true, but I just stubbornly won't believe, then it's not my knowledge, I guess. But not only does it have to be true and I have to believe it, I have to have reasons for believing it. I have to be right in those reasons and be justified in thinking them in order to call it knowledge. Okay, I can have belief, I can have true belief, but knowledge requires support that is justifiable and that justifies the belief. Okay, so that's all he's saying. And then he's saying, well, because it's about knowledge, therefore weak atheism should be the presumption. It is by reference to this inescapable demand for grounds that the presumption of atheism is justified. If it is to be established that there is a God, then we have to have good grounds for believing that this is indeed so. Until and unless some such grounds are produced, we have literally no reason at all for believing. And in that situation, the only reasonable posture must be that of either the negative atheist or the agnostic. So the onus of proof has to rest on the proposition. It must be up to them first to give whatever sense they choose to the word God, meeting any objection that so defined it would relate only to an incoherent pseudo concept. All right. First, the theists have to give us their definition of God, and then they have to defend that definition against any objection we might have that what they're saying is incoherent or self contradictory. Then, when they've accomplished that, second, they have to bring forth sufficient reason to warrant their claim that, in their present sense of the word God, he is, or there is a God. The same applies with appropriate alterations to what is to be made out if what is to be made out is not that that theism is to known to be true, but only more modestly that it can be seen to be at least more or less probable. Okay. So, two things. One, at the end, that's interesting. He's not saying I want to have it proved certainly so that no one who hears the argument will ever be able to question it again. He doesn't say you have to do that. You have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, right? It's an easier standard than that. But you have to prove it in a court where we presume the innocence of God. God is innocent of existing. Okay? We presume that God is innocent of existing in this court, but we are ready to hear your argument, and it has to be coherent, and you have to give us good reasons. And if you do that beyond a reasonable doubt, it doesn't have to be certain, right? It doesn't have to be so crazy. It could be, but you have to pass a certain threshold, and then we will become theists and we will agree with you. But it's proper. His whole essay is saying it's proper to start with the presumption of atheism for the reasons he gave. Um, and the last one was the idea that because it's about claiming knowledge, obviously you're the one with the burden. You're the one with the burden because I'm not claiming to know there is no God. I'm saying I don't yet affirm there is a God until you can give me reasons. I want reasons for it. I want to be a reasonable person. I want to have knowledge of God. I don't just want to believe for no good reason or to advertise to the world I have no good reason and yet I believe, right? So we're going to see essays by fideists who say that's exactly what I want to affirm. The whole point is faith. And we're going to have arguments from Anselm, which are going to absolutely say everything he just said was completely incoherent, right? We're going to have all sorts of different perspectives on this, but this is Anthony Flu's uh, pretty well put case. His pretty well put case that, and this is it's pretty popular, it's pretty common, it's definitely infected the consciousness of just even everyday conversations. You can see on Twitter and in other places online that this is a pretty well accepted starting point for the conversation to many, but not all, right? Um, there are certainly atheists who are going to say, um, I know there cannot be such a thing as a meaningful concept of God. Anthony Flew is opening up the door too much. I can prove there is no God because it's definitely absurd. There's going to be agnostics who say, "By I don't know about God, but I know that the infinite is something I can't know. So we can't ever know, even if he does exist." And right, there's going to be people making all sorts of arguments outside of his approach, but his approach is probably today the most popular one, which, as you know from other classes, that doesn't mean anything to us, except maybe a sign that it's overemphasized. But he does a good job of presenting it, and so let's stop there. There's there's one other thing I want to throw your way, which is about the nature of knowledge, right? So he said knowledge has three prongs. And this goes back to ancient Greece. Justified true belief is essentially what people call it, right? Justified true belief. They even say JTB in short in philosophy circles sometimes. It's a justified true belief. I have reasons for it. It happens to be true, and I believe it. So therefore, I have knowledge. Um, so that's cool because we've never come across that before, but we will. Right? When we do the second year stuff, we're going to look at all the ancient Greeks. That we're going to definitely look at that. But that's been really a largely accepted definition of knowledge for a really long time in philosophy. That knowledge, you shouldn't say I know something unless you've got all three parts of that. I know this is really popular and a lot of people have probably heard of it before, but I'm just, in case you haven't, I'm going to throw out that there was a gentleman who I think was getting his philosophy PhD in South America, I believe. I don't know that much about it. I think in Spanish, he wrote like a two-page dissertation because he just had to finish his dissertation. And it seems this is a story I've heard. He wasn't even that interested in it. He just wrote a two-page philosophy paper in the last like few decades it came out that actually blows apart the definition of justified true belief. It says that justified true belief is not enough for knowledge. Has anybody heard about this before? If anybody's watching on Twitter and you want to DM me or you want to come into the chat and talk about this, I know it's a tangential point right now, but it is actually kind of interesting how he did it. And we could do a session on that. we could do it tonight if you guys want to, or I could put it together. But essentially, what he did is he came up with counter examples, and they're actually named after him. These types of counter examples, they're really clever. Um, where somebody can be justified in believing something, that thing can be true, and they can believe it, and yet it would be inappropriate to say that they know it. Just to give you a taste of what he did to do that, it's really kind of funny. Here's an example. A man is sitting in a receptionist's office waiting for a job interview. There's one other man waiting in the job interview with him. The man who's waiting with him takes all the contents out of his pockets, puts them on a table, and counts out all the coins and realizes he has 17 coins. He empties his pockets. He shows his pockets are empty. He counts everything. He scoops it all up and he puts it all back into his pockets. Then he goes in to have an interview for the job. The original man is just sitting in the lounge. The guy finishes his interview and he leaves. He said, "Hey, have a nice day." He goes and grabs a taxi. The CEO of the company is friends with the other man who's still waiting to have his interview. And he says to the guy, "Listen, I'm pretty sure we're gonna hire that guy. I wanna let I don't wanna let you down or anything, but that guy's got the job for sure." And he says, "Okay, bummer, but we'll still do the interview, whatever." So then this first guy goes to the bathroom. While he's in the bathroom, the CEO gets an email or a fax about how that original guy, although his resume is great, he's a crook who's fleeing the law and he's engaged in corporate espionage and you can't hire him. So now the CEO says, "I'm going to hire the guy in the bathroom, my friend. He was a great candidate anyway. We're definitely going to go with him now." So the decision's been made to hire the guy who's in the bathroom. The guy who's in the bathroom believes that the man who's going to get the job has 17 coins in his pocket. He has good reason to believe that the man who's going to get the job has 17 coins in his pocket. And he himself happens to have 17 coins in his pocket, although he doesn't even know. So he's right that the man who will get the job has 17 coins in his pocket. He has good reason to believe it because he watched that other man count it all out and put it back in his pocket. And he was told by the CEO, that's the guy that's gonna get the job. He has all the good reason in the world to believe that the man who's gonna get the job has 17 coins in his pocket. He happens also to have 17 coins in his pocket, although he doesn't know that's the case. And so then the question is, does the man know that the guy who's gonna get the job has 17 coins in his pocket? He believes it. He's justified in believing it. It would be weird circumstances that it wouldn't be the case for the reasons he thinks. And it's true. It's true that the man who will get the job has 17 coins in his pocket. All of the requirements for knowledge are there, but it's pretty clear that the man does not know. He's mistaken, and yet he's still right and justified in being mistaken. So we can talk about that more some other time. It's not actually important, of course, to this essay, but since we got to introduce the idea of justified true belief, that's a pretty rock and roll event that's happened in philosophy recently is this. Well, we'll look him up and we'll talk about his name and the fact that these are called statements. I for some reason I'm blanking on his name right now, but if you want, tell me that isn't a funny thought experiment. Oh, a Gettier problem. Yeah, this is the guy. Um, so Edmund Gettier, Gettier. He came up with Gettier type counterexamples. We can share this. Um, I don't know how interesting this is to anybody, but I know it's tangential, but it's kind of fun. Um, so these are impressive counterexamples to the idea of justified true belief, which is weird because it was a pretty well established definition through most all of philosophy. And then he just sort of wrote this 2-page paper that got published that kind of shook everything up for quite some time. Um, anyway, you can look into that more if you want, and have we can have a session on it if anybody wants. Okay, so let's get rid of all that. Um, I know we're going to talk a lot about this essay in the after conversation, but I'm going to shut up now. Does anybody want to add anything to the recorded live stream session about Anthony Flew and his argument that before you say you know that God exists and before you say I ought to believe that he exists, you should accept, if you're a theist, you should accept that I presume a negative form of atheism. I don't presume that there is no God for sure, but I presume that it's on you to demonstrate it to me, and your job is to talk to me about God in a way that I can see as meaningful, and then to give me reasons to think that it's actually applicable, that it actually applies to the world, that there is such a God. And he says nobody should be offended by that. It's a position of being totally open to being convinced. It doesn't mean that you have to convince absolutely. You could, and that'd be great, but it also applies to if you just say, "Oh, look, it's really likely that there's a God. Look how good your arguments are." All of that's acceptable. You don't have to adopt atheism yourself personally in order to argue with me about God, but you do have to adopt the idea that it is right for you to have to provide the evidence and to provide the argument. You should agree that I should be presumptively an atheist if you're a theist coming to try to convert me, because that principle is like the presumption of innocence. And the person who's asserting something positive and saying, "Hey, you could know something," is the one who has to demonstrate what it is that could be known. So again, we know that there's lots of categories of ways of responding to this, both on the atheistic, the agnostic, and the theistic side, the fideism. There's all sorts of ways of rejecting this, and even the ontological argument says that everything you're saying is incoherent. It's completely incoherent. It's like a fool talking, right? So we'll look at those positions, right? So there's at least 4 or 5 major camps of philosophical approach that would say this is wrong. But for anybody who thinks there could be a God or there could not be a God. And the only way I'm going to know, or one way that I could come to know, would be through philosophical debate. Maybe the House should adopt that there is a God because the team of lawyers that are arguing on the theistic side are going to win the day. And maybe we should all decide there is no God because the atheistic team is going to be able to always knock down what they say or something. Who knows? But if you agree that it makes sense to have a debate about it at all and that that could be valuable for knowledge, he says, well, okay, then the theist side has to prove something, and the atheistic side has to demonstrate that their proofs don't work or that their terms are incoherent. But until the theistic side has proven something, everybody should just assume atheism in the negative sense. Like they should reserve affirming things and say, I don't know there is no God, but I'm not going to say there is one until you give me reasons. So that's Anthony Flew's perspective on all of this. It's different than was it Clifford? Why am I blanking on his name? I know it's not Clifford. Um, so sorry. Oh, yeah, it is. It's Clifford. Okay. It's different than Clifford, who says it's positively immoral to believe things without a reason. I mean, that would work with Anthony Flew because he's saying, give me reasons, right? Um, we know that there's lots of other perspectives. So I know we've got some theists here. So I'm curious, are there any theists here who say, I think Anthony Flew's right. I think our side should have to prove something. I'm glad he's curious. I'm glad he wants to hear my arguments, but let's have the debate out. And he's right. Until we demonstrate it, he shouldn't be asked by us to affirm something that we haven't shown, or anybody who wants to fight with that or anything. I know we're going to talk a lot in the after space, and maybe this is a topic nobody wants to add things to on the recorded version.
You could, it's like you could come from the other position of saying, well, I know that a God exists, but you need to prove to me that the God doesn't exist. Right? I mean, you're not going to be able to prove that God does exist or doesn't exist. So, I mean, who's to say what would be convincing to him either way? So I just I don't know how convincing of a position it is.
Okay, so now he addressed okay, this is good. So when you say you can't prove that God does or doesn't exist, right? Everybody knows you can't prove it. He said there are people who say that, but he said, but the Catholic Church doesn't believe that. Second Vatican Council, it's an article of faith, it's a doctrine that the knowledge of God is obtainable through nature and through the light of human reason. So you don't have to be Catholic, you could be Protestant or you could be something else. But he's saying, the biggest church, the church, right? They agree that you can prove that God exists, you can demonstrate it, you can get there if you're thinking properly. What you might be saying is, well, I don't know if I trust you to use the light of reason fairly because I think you might have an ulterior motive to not believe. And so I don't have to prove to you to accept it because who knows what your motivation is. Is that more what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, they've already taken a position. So now I need to convince somebody with it said without a reasonable doubt, right?
Which
That's what
isn't
he said.
yeah, it's a standard, but it's not like beyond a reasonable doubt, it's not like the greatest standard in the world. It's just, he even said it could just be more probable, right? You could just say, "Hey, it's 90% likely and 10% unlikely," or something like that. You could do that if you wanted to too, but you should be able to do that within the presumption of atheism.
Right, but if the doctrine from the Catholic Church and everything that already out there was convincing enough, then he wouldn't be in the position that he's in.
Okay, so you suspect that he's posing as an open-minded person who says, "Hey, I just want to be shown." And he's like, "Well, if you really wanted to be shown, you would look at the arguments that are out there. You would have been convinced already." And so I don't believe in negative atheists is what you're saying. All atheists are secretly really positive atheists who really just don't want to believe and are sort of stubbornly in that camp, but some of them pretend like Anthony Flew like they're open-minded to hearing a case. Is that your suspicion maybe? There's no
Yes.
right or wrong. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would suspect that because it's yes, based on his position and saying, well, you need to convince me that God does exist. So I have the assumption that his mind is made up and uh, he says he's being open,
Okay,
but believe that God doesn't
okay.
exist.
So here's a good question for you then. Let's say that you're right. You can't read his mind. Maybe you have good reasons to know that, look, nobody would say that unless they were really just trying to be a sneaky jerk. Okay, fine. Maybe. But what Socrates would do in this situation is presume that they mean what they're saying and then be thrilled to death to present an argument and say, look, I'm going to make such a good argument that if you won't accept it, it'll be clear to everybody that you're a stubborn jerk because, hey, I still believe in my case. And you made the mistake of saying, hey, if you show me a good case, if you show me a good case, I'll be convinced. Well, I've got a good argument. So, hey, I'll even pretend like you're more serious and genuine than maybe I suspect you are because I'll hold you to it later.
Right, but who am I trying to convince, him or everybody else?
Well, that's a good question because in debates, I think there's like 18 dimensions by which debates are valuable, and none of them or almost never does it have anything to do with switching the other party who's taking up the other cause. Occasionally that happens, but
Yeah.
both sides get more sophisticated. Both sides learn how to respond to each other. Both sides refine and revise their positions in the face of criticism that might actually land. There's all sorts of benefits, but also there's the benefit to the audience, right? Somebody might say, I'll never change my mind. I'm going to argue this forever. Good. Get in here. Argue it. We got another guy on the other side who's going to argue something else. And everybody else gets to make up their mind based on how well you're arguing with each other and what arguments you're making. That's super valuable. So he's doing this very much in like a public court of opinion kind of a way. And he's saying, hey, philosophical community, any theists out there, come and prove it to me. I'm not a positive atheist. I'm not saying for sure there's no God. At least I'm saying I'm not. Maybe you could say you don't believe that. But I'm saying, look, I could be convinced, but I'm going to start with assuming that you've got something to prove. And then you go ahead and prove it. There's 2 stages as far as I can tell that you have to prove. Your job. Take it up. What do you think?
Well, I think it's really if you are going to be swayed by a debate, then your belief either way wasn't that strong to begin with. It's a journey you'd have to take on your own to decide for yourself and come to your own conclusion.
I think I know what you're getting at. I think it's a pretty good idea. So let me ask you, there are certainly thinkers on these topics who don't think that the existence of God is like the question of the existence of the Loch Ness monster. They don't think that we should be getting together to look at evidence at all for or against, because knowing God is more like knowing a friend or knowing a person or know Adam knowing his wife or something like that. Depart from me, I never knew you, kind of a personal thing, than it is a proposition that you can affirm for good reason and then that means anything. In fact, in the Christian theology, I think it was Christ who said, even the demons believe that God exists and tremble at his name. What does that mean for anything? I'm going to say, depart from me. I never knew you. So the knowledge of God is not really the knowledge of God that would be valuable in a theological perspective, has nothing to do with being within the purview of philosophical argument in the first place. Right. That's there. So I think you're hinting at something like that. And I think there's certainly a huge case for that.
Right, but it's also of what argument is one thing, right? It's more on who cares what the person says? Like what do they do? How do they live their life?
Okay, so then that goes right along. So that's a William Jamesian kind of a what you believe is demonstrated by your actions. What you say you believe, right? You could be a person who says, I don't believe in God, but very much it's obvious by your behavior that you take seriously the idea of God more than any of the idiot sycophants who keep going to church all day and singing the same songs all the time. Like you care more about piety and divine goodness, then I'm just saying hypothetically, there could be a person who cares so much about that that they're so sickened by the way that everybody else uses the term God that they just say, I'm godless. I don't believe in God. And so, wait a minute, you're completely preoccupied with the notion of God. Your all your arguments against the existence of God really boil down to everybody else arguing for his existence are insufficiently pious and they're actually insulting the divine with their petty notions of who he is. Well, that doesn't sound like a person who doesn't believe in God. That sounds like a person who's offended that you're using his name in vain, right? So like you could say, okay, what you say you believe is so unimportant here that being in the right camp is the wrong way of thinking in the first place, and therefore saying I'm in one camp convinced me to be in the other would still be the wrong framework. Um, so there's a lot of wisdom uh, in what you're saying. Am I getting right the general notion of what you're talking about there? Like the hypocrite who says they believe in God, and then the person who never talks about it, but they try very carefully to live as if he's real. Well, the second one is the believer, and the first one is as much atheistic as anybody else.
Right, right. Somebody who is aiming at raising humanity up versus right putting on a front.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think that's some pretty good criticism. So the fideist position, the ontological position, which says that this is all completely incoherent, and we've talked about the ontological before, but we'll get to it again. Um, it's kind of wild to say something like this is incoherent because it's pretty straightforward and it seems to be very meaningful. But things that seem to be obviously meaningful when applied to things that are infinite can sometimes suddenly not be meaningful. And Kant has shown that with the universe as a whole, and medieval theologians have shown it with God. And we're going to look at the attributes of God and all sorts of things like that in the future. So those are two positions. Then you've brought up the pragmatic idea of faith is an action. It's demonstrated in action, not in propositions in the first place. And the type of knowledge of God isn't the type of knowledge that would be anything in the same category as propositional things that I believe for justified good reasons and all of that that happen to be true. So, like, those are all really, really good. There's a lot of ways, and there's also other ways that we could respond to this from agnostic positions that say, no, wait, the very notion of God is so high and above that no one can speak accurately about him at all. So to claim that you have an argument for his existence that works is to blaspheme or to have a little idol that you worship, but it's not the real infinite if you can talk about it in that deductive, argumentative kind of way. So agnostics, they don't say there is no God. They say it's not possible for us to know. It's the kind of thing that it's absurd and illogical or impious to claim to have wrapped your mind around something like that. Okay, so there's all sorts of ways to differ with this, and I'm glad you're here because if you look at like social media arguments about the existence of God, like in the last 15 years, like the new atheist movement and the Frank Turek arguments, like for his existence, the cosmological ones that he uses and all that. A lot of the tone of that, and I'm not trying to pick on Frank Turek or on, let's call them the Dawkinites and the Frank Turekites, like the people who are fans of that way of thinking. And then maybe what they're actually saying might be a little more sophisticated. We'll leave it there for now. But the nature of that argument, it's like, okay, that might be missing the point on all sides. Like the theistics might be missing the point, the atheistics might be missing the point. All right, all of that is good. I like that. We'll talk more about that and we'll have lots of opportunity. Let's put it aside for a moment. And let's remember that the scriptures, if we're talking to theists, the scriptures also say, come and let us reason together. God talking to humanity and saying, hey, let's let's do some thinking. Let's get our thinking right. And if philosophy is about the rules of right reason, and if it's about organizing our ideas and our principles and getting rid of the incoherent ideas and finding contradictions and then abandoning wrong notions and clarifying our notions, if that's what philosophy is about, and if we were to do it honestly, why shouldn't we expect that there should be a way of getting at least clarity on the notion of the idea of God or make progress in that if we're having honest conversation, or even if we just presume we're having honest debate and conversation with others who we believe are also aimed at the truth, even if they're not, right? Socrates could play this game with people, even if they obviously weren't really aimed at the truth, but just pretended to care about wisdom or piety. He could still say, look, let's talk it out because we'll get closer anyway. Uh, So I guess my question for you is, granting that cases can be made that this is not that God is not the sort of notion that is like the existence of a proton or a Loch Ness monster. It's just not that type of thing you should be having that type of debate about looking for evidence. And there's lots of different perspectives that would come to that conclusion. With all of that being said, if we could put it aside for a moment and say, well, what did C.S. Lewis say? All truth is God's truth, something like that, right? Is God against philosophy? Is he against arguments? I mean, even if they're insufficient, isn't it possible for the theist to say, I bet a good conversation about it would at least get us some insights and get us closer? And if Anthony Flew wants to pretend to, I'm just going to take your presumption that he's pretending. I don't actually think we have any reason to say he's pretending. I mean, I get what you're saying, but if he's going to at least pretend that he's open minded to this, who are we to shirk that? Doesn't the scripture also say, be prepared to give a reason? I mean, I'm probably misquoting the scriptures horribly and being heretical. And if there's some theologians out there who want to come in or some religious people and smack me around, doesn't Paul say something like, be prepared at all times to give a reason for the hope that is within you? Right? Well, give a reason. You could interpret that in the context of, hey, Anthony Flew is saying, I'm open. What are your reasons? And if you say, I don't have reasons, I don't have reasons, you're supposed to believe already. You're a big jerk for not believing. Are you shirking a scriptural responsibility to be prepared to have a reason? Again, understanding that what you're actually saying about the nature of this thing is probably it's not really appropriate to think of it as in that context of propositional and all of that. I mean, I still think that's probably accurate. However, Socrates thought that too, right? He said, we're trying to get to something really big and we're trying to relate to it properly. And you don't have definitions. You can't wrap your head around this. You think you can. So I'm going to ask you, what's the definition? Give it to me. And I'm going to show you that it doesn't work. But in the process of showing you that it doesn't work, there's a personal thing that's happening between us, right? Can God witness? We're talking to the theist right now. Can God witness to a person who at least is claiming to be open-minded? And if you make a claim that you're open-minded, you actually will behave in a way that is adherent to that, right? If even if Anthony Flew like, ha ha ha, I'm an atheist and I'll never change my mind. He said publicly, I'm open-minded to this. Show me the reasons, which puts him in a position of very easily admitting, like, oh wow, you gave me some reasons, right? Even if he didn't want to at first or thought it wasn't possible, an invitation like that to be poo-pooed away and say, from I'm talking to the theist, not even as a philosopher right now, to talk to a theist and say, "Oh, you're just impatient for people that don't already agree with you." I'm not even sure your notions are very well worked out. And Anthony was going to check. This Tony guy over here was going to be real hard on you if your notions weren't clear. You could have benefited from that. You might have gotten rid of little idols that you thought were God and gotten closer to the real thing. You could have benefited yourself. Plus, you would have had a personal interaction. You might have been able to help him see the light through. I'm talking again to the theists, those who believe that there is a light that they're in relationship to. They should probably jump at the chance to say, hey, I even think Anthony's full of shit, but he's claiming, let's go talk it out. And I'm going to try to find some arguments for him. I think you'd probably agree with that. So I'm not chastising you or anything. I'm just trying to sort of present all of the ways that we could be approaching this, right? None of this has to do with my opinion on any of this, by the way. It's just we're going
Sure.
with
I
Anthony.
mean, you could say, look, the principles that are put in place for religion are worth it alone, whether God exists or not, is having a positive outcome, not only for your life, the life of others, and in even humanity.
Yeah, and the conversation's a good one. So here's a thing that I think annoys atheists a lot, and I think they're right to be annoyed by it when it comes to theists and religious people, including fideists, people who say, "Look, it's based in faith. I don't have reasons." I mean, I try to be as reasonable as I can about it, but ultimately there's a faith issue here. Um, I think there's something very annoying and properly annoying, I'll even say, to a non-believer when they hear a and I understand, again, I understand the context of what you're saying. This is personal, it's relational, it's profound, it's not something you can define by definition. It's supposed right. I'm not disagreeing with you. I could be on your team, completely a theist over there. But I'm going to say I think that if you're thinking of the atheistic types as lost and far away from the truth, and maybe even not interested in the truth, even though they're claiming to be, and you should be careful about that, I think. But from their perspective, a person who says, I have an awful lot of truth that you don't have. Oh, and I'm not taking any questions today. You either agree with me or I'm going to go do something else. It politically and socially, it seems arrogant to them. And I don't know that they're wrong in thinking that that's quite an arrogant thing for a religious person to do, right? Shouldn't you say, hey, I have this special thing and it's been given to me by a divine revelation and this is wonderful. I shouldn't expect everybody to accept that just because I claimed it. I should try to meet them where they're at. And if I'm like, oh, you're asking too many questions, buddy. I'm out of here. It's like, well, maybe there are certainly people who are disingenuous with their questions, but philosophers don't respond to too many questions as if that's even a thing. They just want to keep going with the conversation. And not everybody has to be a philosopher, but that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing in this class. And I don't know. I don't even know if I have much of a point, but if I made it,
If the
right.
if the other person is intentionally filibustering, then that's one thing. But we shouldn't shy away from questions. Other than
Yeah,
that,
that doesn't count, right? That doesn't count as a good conversation. Somebody like, let's say the not real Anthony Flew. Let's call him the zombie imitating Anthony Flew. If he came in and said, "Prove to me there's a God," and every time you started talking, you threw a tomato at your mouth, like, okay, there's not a conversation there. You're not debating. You're not interested. You're just being a jerk. And now you're excusing yourself from the conversation. If you'll calm down, we can keep talking. But, obviously it would have to actually be a conversation. But when somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I want to have a conversation about this, you should take them at their word and then hold them to their word if they start deviating, right? Because
Mhm.
again, even if what we're talking about isn't the sort of thing that you could prove, even if it's not the sort of thing that is susceptible to definition, if it's infinite and beyond us, but we're trying to relate to it, as Socrates said, even if it's of that nature, Socrates used the opportunity of everybody thinking that knowledge was so much easier and that could just be owned to have the conversations, to invite them into it, and then to maybe lure them into it, and then to engage with them in a way where he could impart a deeper wisdom through going along with their arguments and figuring out what was wrong with them. And that was getting educated, that was getting enlightened, not by then saying, and here's all my truths and how I can prove them. Socrates never did that. He said, I don't actually know myself. It's too big. It's too big for me to know. You claim to know. Great. Please teach me. I wish I knew like you did. And then the Greeks had to invent the word irony for Socrates because it was clear that they didn't know either and that he could easily demonstrate that fact. But then he didn't say, and I know, and here's all the things you have to agree with from me. He meant it. He meant it's too big for us. Let's grow up and learn that it's like that. And then if you're Meno, you adjust your way of thinking. You learn how to think philosophically. And if you're Euthyphro, you run away and get upset and think that's a big evil jerk who's making me look bad. And if you're Anitis, you take him to court and charge him with impiety and you make him drink hemlock. Everybody's here to do what they're here to do. What we're here to do is have the good conversation. And if I think if anybody says they want to have it, we should have the Socratic attitude towards them, no matter what we suspect. And then we should hold them to it. And I think you'd probably agree. I want to go to the after conversation where we just talked together. So I'm going to shut up and say, is there anything else anybody wants to add first, though, before we go and end the recording? Boom. All right. Friends who are watching on the interwebs and the www, whatever, as Norm Macdonald used to say, we'll see you next time. Tomorrow morning, we're doing our this is a year 1 class. Tomorrow morning, we're doing our year 3 material, which is through the lens of Nietzsche, looking at philosophy. And we're doing deep dives into characters made possible by Nietzsche, children of Nietzsche, people contemporary wrestling with Nietzsche. And so we're going to continue our Jordan Peterson classes in that context tomorrow in the morning. And I think that we're going to be reading Act 3 of Shakespeare's Hamlet, the first of 4 plays we're going to be reading by Shakespeare earlier than that in the morning, in Spaces, I believe, not on the recorded videos. So we'll be doing the Space tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time for the 3rd act of Hamlet, which is the first of the 4 Shakespeare plays we're reading on Saturdays. And then we're going to do our Jordan Peterson thing tomorrow. So we'll see you all later.